Hey everybody, welcome to Beaming Notes, and today we're going to look at the summary of the poem I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. Summary, stanza 1. A free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till the current ends, and dips his wing in the orange sun rays and dares to claim the sky. The poem begins with a spirit of freedom and joy. The opening lines describe the liberty of a free bird that can move anywhere it wants, no restrictions. The bird has the freedom to move as freely as the wind moves. It flies in the direction of the current. It seems like the bird has immersed its wings in the orange sun rays. The sky has become its habitat and is bold enough to claim the sky as its own. It flies like it owns the whole sky. Summary, stanza 2. But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The next stanza immediately contrasts the freedom of the free bird to the restricted life of the caged bird. The poet uses the word stalk to describe how the caged bird looks through its cage to intensify the sense of fear that arises from leading a restricted life. He can almost never clearly see through the bars. The bird lives in a limited space. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied. Wings symbolize the freedom of flight and the freedom of movement. The caged bird is denied its natural right. The bird is angry and frustrated at his situation and he desires to escape, but he is helpless. His freedom is forcibly taken away and he has no other choice than to open his throat and sing. This seems to be the only source of joy and refreshment in his life. Summary, stanza 3. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still. And his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. Even though the caged bird tries to sing, his voice quavers as he is full of fear. He longs for freedom, which is something he never had. He does not know what freedom feels like, but still there is a part of him that eagerly wants to break free of the shackled existence. The longing in his voice is so intense that it is heard at faraway places. The pathetic situation of the enslaved bird is depicted in his yearning desire for freedom. Summary, stanza 4. The free bird thinks of another breeze, and the trade wind soft through the sighing trees, and the fat worms waiting on a dawn-bright lawn, and he names the sky his own. In this stanza, the poet goes on to highlight the unrestricted life of a free bird that thinks of another breeze. The free bird has a freedom to enjoy and fly through the soft wind that passes through the branches of the sighing trees. This image is the epitome of liberty and freedom. The free bird then thinks of the fat worms that seem to be waiting to be consumed by him. The bird seems to name the whole sky its own as it experiences the utmost freedom to rule the sky and go anywhere it wants. This stanza brings up the idea that when you are at peace, the entire world is yours. Summary, stanza 5. But a caged bird stands on the grave of dreams, his shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The cage has now become the grave of the bird's dreams. He is imprisoned and forced to exist in a dark and confined space where there is no scope to dream. His condition is worse than a nightmare. The bird's cries for freedom resemble the screams of someone having a nightmare. There is a strong sense of pity, helplessness, and sadness in the bird's song. We observe a repetition of the lines, his wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. This repetition serves to intensify the sense of tragedy in the bird's captive life. Summary, stanza 6. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. The poem closes with the refrain in which the bird dreams of his freedom from his monotonous existence. The final stanza is a repetition of the third stanza, which serves to stress on the sorrowful condition of the caged bird. However, this repetition also emphasizes on the bird's dedication to keep hoping. He chooses to sing for the freedom as this is the only kind of freedom that is available to him. He does not lose hope and continues to dream of the day when he will be a free bird. Theme: freedom and confinement. The theme of freedom and confinement is the most predominant theme in the poem. The image of the free bird living a life of unparalleled joy and liberty stands for freedom, while enslavement in the poem is symbolized by the restricted life of the caged bird, whose wings are clipped and feet are tied. The poem begins with a description of undisturbed movement of the bird that is free to fly anywhere it wants. The sky is its natural habitat and it is free to dip its wing in the orange rays of the sun covering the sky. The free bird lives in its own life with no boundaries and control. However, the caged bird lives an imprisoned life in a narrow cage. The caged bird can hardly get a glimpse of the sky. It cannot move freely as its wings have been clipped. It lives in a helpless and miserable state and only longs for freedom in its sad songs. The free bird is able to enjoy the cool breeze that passes through the leafy branches of trees. But the cage for the caged bird has become a grave of dreams where there is no freedom and no happiness. The caged bird is full of rage, but there is nothing it can do about it except to sing songs in the hope of a better tomorrow. The conditions of the free bird and caged bird aptly represents the social disparity between the whites and the African Americans during the civil rights era. The restricted life of the caged bird stands for the inequality, injustice, and discrimination that the African Americans had to face during that period. Voice against injustice. The caged bird is subjected to constant mental, physical, and emotional torture. Its freedom is forcibly taken away, but even after such cruel treatment, we observe the bird hopes for freedom. It refuses to give up and longs for a day when it would experience its freedom of life. It sings for freedom even in such a miserable state. It is a reference to the condition of the African Americans who wrote songs, sang, and danced in hope of freedom and equality. The caged bird did raise its voice against discrimination, even though it was heard at as a distant voice. Racism. This poem indirectly draws our attention to the racial discrimination that existed in America during the time of apartheid that separated the whites and the African Americans in the society. The caged bird symbolizes the African Americans and the inhuman way in which they were treated just because the different color of their skin. The poet expresses the restricted and enslaved life of the African Americans through the representation of the clipped wings and tied feet of the caged bird. The caged bird thus represents the entire African American community that was subjected to social, cultural, and religious discrimination and were denied the right to freedom. Autobiographical sketch of Maya's personal life. On many levels, this poem can be seen as an autobiography of Maya's life. The caged bird is a symbol of Maya herself, who had to face a lot of discrimination, harassment, and assault since a very early age. She belonged to an African American community, and on top of that, she was a woman. She was terrorized by the kind of oppression under which she was constantly living. She felt like the trapped bird that could not do anything but to open its throat and sing. However, like the caged bird, she refused to give up and expressed herself through her writings. Just like the caged bird sang for freedom, she wrote for freedom. Tone. The tone of the poem fluctuates between the feelings of joy, positivity, and freedom to that of sadness and misery. The poet has chosen an array of words to depict the two contrasting images of the free bird and the caged bird vividly. The vocabulary used is simple and lucid. The poem begins on a positive and refreshing note as a free bird's unconfined life is described. The tone changes from happy and fulfilled to one that is grief-stricken and despairing. The merry and joyful state of the free bird is always made evident through the positivity in the stanzas in which there is a mention of the free bird. However, the trapped condition of the caged bird is followed by a note of sadness and anguish in the poem. The free bird gets to move about anywhere she desires with no one to control it, while the caged bird hardly gets to see through its cage. The contrast between the conditions of the two birds is heightened by the image of the clipped wings and tied feet of the caged bird. The tone becomes despondent as the caged bird sings of freedom in a quivering voice. The narrow cage and the fearful trills intensifies a sense of tragedy in the life of the caged bird that is devoid of justice and happiness. The free bird can confidently claim the sky, whereas all the caged bird can do is sing its heart out. The relentless agony and suffering of the caged bird expressed through the words like grave, nightmare, narrow, clipped, and scream add to the distressing and woeful tone of the poem.